There's a saying that goes, if you want to understand water, don't ask a fish. The fish has never known anything else. It has no frame of reference for what water even is. Culture is like that. It's the water we swim in. It shapes how we see the world, how we communicate, what we expect from other people, and what we find normal or strange or rude or respectful. And most of the time, we don't notice it at all. It's just how things are. This is about learning to notice the water, about developing what communication scholars call intercultural competence, the awareness and skills to communicate effectively across cultural differences. When most of us hear the word culture, we think of food and holidays and maybe traditional clothing or music. Those are cultural expressions, but culture itself is something deeper. Culture is a shared system of values and beliefs and norms and practices that a group of people use to make sense of the world and coordinate their behavior. It's the invisible operating system running underneath everything, telling us what matters, what's appropriate, what's offensive, what counts as success, how close to stand to someone, whether it's okay to disagree with an elder in public, and whether silence is awkward or comfortable. Culture is learned. We absorb it from the families and communities we grow up in. It's shared. It's not just individual preference, it's collective. And it's largely invisible to the people who hold it because it feels like common sense rather than a cultural choice. One thing worth noticing, culture is not the same as ethnicity, though they can overlap. A person's cultural context includes their nationality, region, religion, family background, generation, profession, and more than that. We all carry multiple cultural memberships simultaneously, and they can sometimes pull in different directions. And while we're at it, race is a social construct, not a biological category. And that doesn't make it any less real in its effects. How people are perceived and treated and shaped by racial classification is deeply consequential. But understanding race as constructed rather than innate is actually consistent with everything we're saying about culture. Meaning is made, not given. There's some important terms to know in this section and even for our lives. So salience, co-culture, in-groups, out-groups, cultural competence, and cultural humility. Most of these are in the learning pages and the glossary. There's a ubiquitous but super useful image that we can look at. Think of an iceberg. How much do you see? 10% is above the water, but 90% is below the water. And that's super useful when we think about culture, because the visible top above the waterline, the food and the clothing, and the language and the holidays and the music, these are all parts of culture that we can easily observe and name. But the much larger mass below the surface, the values, the assumptions, the beliefs, the unspoken rules that actually drive behavior, that's the part that shapes communication most powerfully, and it's almost entirely invisible. We rarely question what's below our own waterline because it just feels like common sense. Intercultural competence starts with recognizing that other people have an iceberg too, and that they're below the surface isn't wrong, it's just different from ours. Within any larger culture, there are smaller cultural groups, identities, what we call co-cultures. And these are groups that exist within a main cultural context, but they have their own distinct norms and values and communication styles and sense of identity. So co-cultures form around all kinds of shared identities and experiences like age and gender and sexual orientation and disability and religion and socioeconomic class, regions that you live in, professions, subculture memberships. The gaming community, for example, is a co-culture, and so is the military, and so is the deaf community, and so is a tight-knit immigrant neighborhood with its own distinct fusion of heritage and adopted culture. And why does this matter for communication? Because we often assume our communication norms are universal when they're actually co-cultural. The rules about how directly to give feedback, or whether to maintain eye contact, or how much emotional expression is appropriate in a professional setting, and what counts as small talk versus real conversation. And these will vary enormously across co-cultural contexts. The assumption that our own cultural norms are just normal is one of the most common sources of miscommunication across difference. So when we encounter someone else who communicates differently from how we do, the instinct is often to read that difference as a flaw. They're being rude or cold or too emotional or evasive, when really they're just operating by a different set of rules. Intercultural communication is two or more cultures or co-cultures exchanging messages in a manner that is influenced by their different cultural perceptions and symbol systems, both verbal and nonverbal. There's a lot to unpack in that. So we're going to continue on with looking at culture. There's a lot in this idea to go through, so stay with me. So, one of the most widely used frameworks for understanding cultural differences came from a Dutch social psychologist named Gert Hofstede. In the 1970s and 80s, he conducted one of the largest cross cultural studies ever done, surveying employees at IBM in over 50 countries. And from that data, he identified several dimensions along which cultures tend to differ. A word of honest framing before we go through them. Hofstede's framework is useful, but it does have real limitations. It was developed from corporate survey data, which doesn't represent the full range of human experience. And it describes tendencies and averages across national cultures. It does not describe individuals. And it can slide into stereotyping if we're not careful. So we use it as a lens for observation, not a label maker. With that said, here are the dimensions: individualism versus collectivism. And this is probably the most widely discussed dimension. Individualistic cultures like the United States and Australia and much of Western Europe tend to emphasize personal goals, individual achievement, independence. Collectivistic cultures, common across much of Asia and Latin America and Africa, tend to prioritize group harmony and family loyalty and collective identity over individual goals. And this shows up in communication constantly: how we give feedback, whether we value directness or harmony preservation, and how we handle disagreement in front of others. And then power distance. This dimension describes how a culture relates to hierarchy and authority. High power distance cultures accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. Deference to authority figures is normal and expected. Low power distance cultures tend toward flatter hierarchies where questioning a boss or professor is seen as normal and healthy. The same behavior, a student disagreeing with a professor in class, can land very differently depending on the power distance norms of the culture involved. Uncertainty avoidance. Some cultures are more comfortable with ambiguity and change. Others prefer clear rules and structure and predictability. So, high uncertainty avoidance cultures tend to have more formal rules and they feel more anxious when things are unclear. Low uncertainty avoidance cultures are more comfortable with, we'll figure it out approaches. And this shapes everything from how meetings are run to how contracts are written to how people respond to unexpected change. Long term versus short term orientation. And this dimension describes how a culture relates to time and planning. Long term oriented cultures value persistence and thrift and planning for the future. Short-term oriented cultures tend to value tradition, social obligations, and present-focused results. This affects how organizations make decisions, how people think about investment and sacrifice, and how much weight is given to historical precedent versus current pragmatism. Remember, these dimensions describe tendencies at the cultural level. Any individual may diverge significantly from their culture's average. Use this framework to build awareness and to ask better questions, not to predict how a specific person will behave. So, how do we get better at communicating across cultural difference? Well, that's what the idea of intercultural communication competence is about. So, competence in this context doesn't mean knowing everything about every culture. That's impossible. It means developing the motivation and the knowledge and the skills to navigate difference thoughtfully. Motivation matters more than people expect. Intercultural competence starts with actually wanting to understand, being curious rather than defensive, and interested rather than threatened. If we approach cultural difference with the assumption that our way is the right way and other ways are deviations from the norm, we're already stuck. Competence requires genuine openness. Knowledge means learning how culture works, not memorizing stereotypes, but understanding frameworks, knowing our own cultural assumptions, and developing awareness of how those assumptions might affect our perceptions of others. Skills are the practical behaviors, so asking questions rather than assuming, tolerating ambiguity, and adapting our communication style without losing our own voice. Also, checking perceptions before acting on them. So, intercultural competence is not about becoming someone else, it's about expanding our range. There's also a concept worth naming called ethnocentrism, and that's the tendency to view our own cultural practices as the standard against which all others are measured. Some degree of ethnocentrism is natural, it's how culture works. And the problem is when it becomes invisible, when we mistake our cultural norms for universal truths and judge other people's communication as wrong or deficient rather than just simply different. So the antidote isn't cultural relativism. We don't have to pretend all cultural practices are equally good. It's cultural humility, the ongoing practice of recognizing that our perspective is just one among many and approaching other ways of being with curiosity rather than judgment. Before we close, one more thing attending to. Learning about cultural dimensions and communication differences can sometimes create a false sense of mastery. Like, now we know how Japanese culture works or what Latin American communication is like. That kind of certainty is usually the first sign that we've stopped actually looking and started substituting a shortcut for understanding. Real intercultural competence is uncomfortable, but in a productive way. It involves sitting with not knowing, asking questions that reveal our own ignorance, and being corrected, but not defensive about that. The goal is not to become an expert on other cultures. The goal is to become someone who engages with actual human beings, complex, individual, not fully explained by any framework. So we want to treat that with genuine curiosity and genuine respect. We are all always products of cultures we didn't choose and can't fully see. The most interculturally competent thing we can do is start there. We've covered a lot of ground. We defined culture as a shared system of values and practices that shapes how we communicate, and it's the water that we swim in. And we looked at co-cultures and the danger of mistaking our own norms for universal ones. And we worked through Hofstede's dimensions as a framework for noticing cultural difference without reducing people to stereotypes. And we talked about what intercultural competence actually looks like in practice, motivation and knowledge and skills and cultural humility. And these concepts connect directly to everything we covered about perception. How we perceive other people's communication is filtered through our own cultural lenses. The mistaken attributions we make about other people's behavior are often culturally shaped. Intercultural competence and perception checking belong in the same toolkit. We live in a world that requires all of this from us. And the workplaces and the families and the communities and the classrooms that we navigate are not culturally homogeneous. And the communicators who do well in that world are the ones who learned to notice the water. Culture shapes everything: what we say, how we say it, what we expect in return, and how we interpret what we get back. Understanding that is not a small thing. It is genuinely one of the most useful things that a communicator can develop. Thanks for watching. Go and notice the water. Thanks for sharing this with me, and have a great day.